And first on the agenda will be Paul Hardman to discuss the South African citrus export projection model with us. Paul is our Industry Affairs Manager at the CGA, and I think all of us know him by now. Thank you, Paul. You can come online.
Thank you.
Can you put on your mic?
Kenneth, can you, I presume you can hear me, otherwise just let me know, just confirming that my sound is fine. Okay, let me just turn on my presentation. And I'm just going to turn my camera off so that you can see the slides a bit bigger. But thanks, guys. I'm Paul Hardman with the CGA, and it's been a joy to actually work on this long-term crop projection model, which we last did in 2016, and now I've updated. So yeah, thank you for this. And perhaps I can just pre-warn you, there's a lot of information in the presentation. So basically, the idea is to give you a sense of the numbers, but to really get into the detail, one would have to go through a bigger exercise. So my intent is just to give you a sense of what's in there, and then I'm sure through the organizers you'll be able to get a copy of it, and then I'm sure there will be also other opportunities to look at how the model really works. So really looking at three parts to the presentation. The model is based on obviously the tree census and a lot of statistics that are coming through from that exercise. So I'm going to just give you some basics there, and then get into the model itself, looking at the key assumptions and the outputs, and then finally wrap up with answering that question for how much confidence can we have in the model. Okay, starting with descriptive stats, basically this is derived from the tree census that was concluded at the end of last year through the phytosanitary registration process. Basically, the 2,500 PUCs, and those belong to about 1,000, just over 1,000 organizations. So basically, each organization or farmer has on average about 2.5 PUCs. What's most interesting, of course, is that big number there of 96,000 hectares of citrus, well up from where we were last year on 88,000 hectares. So a massive increase, and I think that's just reflected in obviously the budget sales that have been coming through and now coming into production. The number of orchards, it's 26,300, giving us an average of about 3.65 hectares per orchard there, with a median of about 2.3. And then we've got a massive wide range in terms of the age of orchards. The oldest, there's two that are at 110 years old. But if you actually look at the average and the median, what you see is that we as an industry are actually keeping up with our replanting rate. So there's a lot of young trees in the ground, and that bodes well for the future. Okay, if we look at where the hectares are and where they've been planted, that gives you a sense of them across the different CGA regions. And yeah, we've got a group there, sort of the big four of Sanders River, Western Cape, Leicester, Sterling, and Sen West, with huge plantings. Then we've got a sort of a middle range between sort of 7,000 and about 3,000 hectares. Burgersfort coming into that group now, and then obviously a whole lot of smaller regions as well. I know the Eswatini volumes, hectares, they are a bit low, but the balance that are actually going in Swaziland are directed at the processing, not export partners. Okay, as we know, Valencias has obviously dominated our exports, and that's where the greatest plantings has been. But one clearly notices the mandarins and lemons coming through after significant plantings over the last couple of years. So that gives you a sense of the different varieties. And if you just compare that now to what's planted in the last 5 years, in other words, orchards that are under 5 years old, you can clearly see how mandarins and lemons are dominating the interest over the last 5 years from new planting perspective. I thought it'd be just interesting to just reflect on rootstocks as well. There's a citrange, obviously the dominant rootstock, followed by rough lemon and a swingle there. And so that gives you a bit of a sense of what plantings are. It would be interesting to go into a bit more detail in terms of rootstocks per area and then rootstocks per different variety of cultivar. So that is available in the tree census if anybody wants to go into a bit more detail on that. Okay, getting into the crop protection model itself, I need to just run through some key assumptions because these actually determine to a large extent how the model output really looks at the end. The first major assumption is to realize that this is a production model and not an export model. So basically we're looking at what is available for sale potentially, and it's not trying to predict actually what's going to be happening in the market, which is a lot more difficult to build into a single model. So that's the first thing. The next is obviously looking at future budwood sales. One is trying to assess what does the future look like from a budwood sales perspective. What are people going to be doing in the next 5, 10 years? And to do that, we have to some extent look back, and the base model works on an average of the last 4 years sales of budwood. That sort of is the baseline for going forward. And on all these assumptions, actually, at the end of the presentation, I'll show you what happens when you start varying these or adjusting them to look at different scenarios. The model assumes that between 75 and 85% of buds actually coming out of the foundation block turn into trees, actual trees, which is an estimate we got from the foundation block some time ago, and we work on that. The most significant change that in this edition of the long-term crop projection model is to try and accommodate this phenomenon to answer the question, when are orchards replaced or removed? If you actually look at the tree census data, you realize in some areas and some varieties, the orchard age is much older on average, and the oldest orchards are much older than they are in other areas. So we've actually adapted the model to be more realistic and reflect those realities. And I think that's also helped improve the accuracy of the model as well. Obviously, there's typical yields per ton per area, and then obviously your pack-out percentages as well. Obviously, these numbers can vary depending on recent climate conditions and the actual season itself. So we take long-term averages there, and we plug those into the model. One thing that's starting to influence the model significantly now is the regional capacity for expansion. So how many hectares are there in a particular region that can be planted to new orchards, sorry. And so that will reflect on also a little bit later. And then obviously looking at just planting density. And for the sake of the model, we've looked at the last 5 years. But if I just go to the next slide, and we can just see how things can vary quite a lot, even in terms of planting density. So this is just a table showing that on the first column the all average number of trees per hectare for the different varieties. And then if you compare that to 16 and 20 years ago, and then those last 2 columns, if you look at the latest ones from the last 5 years. So that's the all average is about 775 trees per hectare, which is quite close to where we were 16 to 20 years ago, 792, 2% difference. And you compare that to now, in the last 5 years, sets have been planted at 622 on trees per hectare on average. So, and this obviously all feeds into the model, and you're trying to take this into account when you're predicting how the future looks and how many buds actually translate into hectares and trees out there. Okay, so this is probably the most interesting slide in the presentation, and what really does the base model output look like. And there you have it. So in 2021, estimating slightly short of 150 million cartons. By 2026, exceeding 200 million cartons, and that's steadily rising for the next 5 years, and then sort of flattening off. But by 2036, looking at 270 million 15 kg equivalent cartons. So obviously we as an industry been quite aware of the growth that we've seen, but it certainly looks like that growth is going to continue. We look at then the makeup of the different cultivars, and what becomes abundantly clear is that sort of yellowy orangey color, which is the mandarins coming through in the middle there, going from about 16.3 million cartons in the model, getting pushed up right to almost 80 million cartons by 2036. It's less obvious in the presentation here, but the lemons also expanding very quickly, and also the lenches at the top. So those three areas remain the big growth areas, but all of them growing a little bit. And where do we see that extra volume coming from? Essentially, all regions look to be growing. So across the country, expansion is taking place. And this is an area that the model uses quite a lot of the land and water constraints to determine where the next bud will be planted. So how the model actually works is, if you take a particular cultivar or variety and ask the question, where will the next bud be planted? It looks at the recent history and also the probabilities of that and allocates it to an area. And that's why if you look at that grey line just above the second from the bottom there, that's the Burgersfort area. And because it's very dominated by soft citrus new plantings, new soft citrus plantings, and we know mandarins is growing very quickly, tends to be allocated to that area first. So that's why you're getting growth in those areas. But as I said, across the board, most areas are looking to grow. This slide might be a little bit busy, but it's worth just showing you, because what you're looking at is different model outputs based on different assumptions, and how those assumptions being adjusted. Okay, so there's basically three aspects or three phases to this model, which I'll just reflect on. That first green sort of bracket there reflects the first 5 years. And what it shows you is, irrespective of basically what you do with the assumptions, the volume is going to grow. So whether you change your tree densities or bud width sales or anything like that, basically it has very little impact on the model, and essentially we committed to volumes, and those sort of volumes getting to about 200 million cartons over the next 5 years. We're on that path already. And then when you get into that middle phase, the orange bracket there to some extent your tree ages and how you monitor or manage your replant schedules, that type of thing starts to play a role, and you sort of can see some more variation creeping in between the different models. And then in your final section there, that's when your assumptions really start to have a bigger impact. So you're probably interested to know what that orange or yellow line is. That model was basically, if you take out all the land and water constraints and you basically free up the model, you make it unlimited sort of capacity to grow, and you can see that's just enormous growth. So by 2030, so this is 10 years time, you're looking at over 300 million cartons. So that, I guess, is really a big question. Is there that much land and water available to grow that far? And the other interesting thing for me was one of the other models there, I think it's the maroon model, was basically I did an exercise of halving the bud width sales. So if you look at the last recent years, we sold about 6.6 million buds per year, And if you halve that to 3, it actually shows that it has very little impact on the model. So essentially, not only are we committed over the next 5 years, we committed over the next 15 years to volumes of around at least 250 million cartons. Okay, so getting to the end now, just looking at the model accuracy. Can we depend on this model? So I just pulled out the 2014 model and the 2016 model, those two, and compared that to the actuals. And yes, we do actually bounce around quite close to the actual volume. So the models do seem to be fairly accurate. And there you can see the 2021 model overlaid on that, and you can see that continued big growth. You know, when we first did the 2014 one, I mean, that orange line didn't look flat. It looked more like this 2021. It just looked like exceptional growth. But now that we compare it to where we're at now, it looks looks fairly flat. Okay, so just to conclude then, basically we've updated the model on the recent information, mainly the 2023 census, upgraded the model to reflect when orchards are removed, and plugged that all in. It shows that by 2026 we're looking at 200 million cartons at least. That will continue to grow obviously beyond that. And it's clear mandarins, Valencias and lemons represent the commodities that are growing the fastest. And then, as I pointed out, when you start playing with the model and working with the assumptions, how we go and how fast we increase beyond about 2030 will depend on the land and water constraints and whether those really start to impact on us. So that's my presentation. Thanks very much, Hannes. I'm going to hand back to you. And as I said, there's obviously a lot more information in here, but that's